February 17th, 1991, started out like any other workday for 41-year-old Northwest Airlines flight attendant Nancy Ludwig. She was dropped off at the Minneapolis airport by her husband, Art Ludwig, who was a 57-year-old retired TV producer at the time. Art always dropped Nancy off and picked her up when she worked, so that particular night wasn't anything special to either of them. Nancy was scheduled to end her workday at the Detroit Metro Airport after working multiple flights. From the Detroit airport, Nancy would take a shuttle to the Hilton Airport Inn in Romulus, Michigan, where she and other crew members would spend the night before heading back home the following morning. A little after 9 p.m., Nancy took the hotel elevator to the third floor and walked down a long hallway to her room, number 354. The next morning, a housekeeper bypassed Nancy's room after seeing a Do Not Disturb sign hung on the door. Later that day, however, after Nancy should have checked out, the housekeeper opened the door and entered the room. The television was turned on, tuned to CNN's coverage of the Persian Gulf War, as the housekeeper entered the room and made a gruesome discovery. She found a body on the bed covered in sheets and in a pool of blood. From the South Shore of Lake Erie, this is Great Lakes True Crime. The housekeeper didn't initially think that what she walked into was a murder scene. Instead, her first instinct was that a woman had suffered a miscarriage in the room. Shocked by what she saw, she ran downstairs to alert her supervisor, Paul Janiga, to what she had discovered. Paul went up to room 354, lifted up the sheets on the bed, and first noticed a heel. He then saw that a woman's throat had been severely cut. Knowing that this was a crime scene, both Paul and the housekeeper cleared the room and immediately called police. They also quickly looked up the room's occupant and found that it was Nancy Ludwig. Homicide Detective Mike Larson was the first police officer to arrive on the scene. He noted multiple stab wounds and a massive amount of blood. The cut was so deep that the knife actually hit the spine on Nancy's back. She also had very disturbing wounds on her hands. It was clear that Nancy fought her attacker and grabbed the knife by the blade. Unfortunately, the attacker was able to pull it out of her hands and continue his sadistic attack. It was a very violent killing. Detectives found drops of blood on the bathroom floor, suggesting that the killer washed himself off after the murder was complete. Fortunately, police were able to take blood and semen samples from the room. After reviewing the crime scene, it was theorized that the attacker had followed Nancy to her room and forced his way in after she unlocked her door. Detectives also noticed that the perpetrator had removed everything from the room that could potentially identify him or the victim, including the trash bag. Her purse was gone. Her suitcase was gone. All her clothes were gone. They had no definitive way of knowing who the woman was. Although the room was registered to Nancy and it was assumed that she was the victim, detectives could find nothing to identify her other than the fact that it was registered to her. Fingerprints of Nancy were taken for identification purposes, and her body was taken away by the Wayne County Medical Examiner. Police had no initial suspect in the case. Back in Minnesota, Art Ludwig, of course, hadn't heard from Nancy that day, and he immediately suspected that something wasn't right because it was so out of character for Nancy to not call. Finally, Art did receive a phone call, but it wasn't from Nancy, it was from her supervisor. The supervisor advised Art that 2 policemen were at his door and he should let them in. So he let the 2 police officers in, then got back on the phone with the supervisor, who told him that police in Michigan had found a body and it appeared to be Nancy. A surge of total helplessness engulfed Art. Art headed to Detroit as quickly as possible and went straight to the morgue where he identified Nancy's body. Art knew at that moment that life as he knew it was over. The autopsy revealed that Nancy had small puncture wounds all over her body, suggesting that she was tortured before the murder. She was also sexually assaulted. Although DNA was a fairly new tool to police at the time, experts began analyzing the blood and semen samples taken from the hotel room. The following morning, police canvassed every room in the hotel, searching for witnesses, and they found one, another flight attendant who noticed something unsettling that night. It turns out that this particular flight attendant had a habit of getting exercise while staying in hotels by running up and down the stairwells. When she went past Nancy's floor that night, she noticed a creepy man hovering in the doorway from the stairwell into the hallway, propping the door open with his body. He really creeped her out, so she made a mental note of him. Paul Janiga, the hotel staff member mentioned earlier, had also noticed the man, thinking that something just didn't seem right about him. Paul didn't focus too much on the guy, but he did remember that he had glasses, short bushy hair, and seemed kind of agitated. Detectives concluded that the creepy guy was most likely Nancy's killer. They figured he lingered in the stairwell waiting for Nancy to open her door, and when she did, he barged in behind her and forced her into the room. Unfortunately, with only brief glimpses of the man and no security video in the hotel, police could not identify their suspect. Meanwhile, the news of Nancy's murder made national headlines, and as the story made its way through the flight attendant community, Flight attendant Phil Arcia recalled that he stayed at the same hotel the night of Nancy's murder. He remembered that while looking out his hotel room window, he saw what he assumed was another flight attendant carrying a large suitcase out to a car. He recognized the luggage that the man was taking to the car because it was a specific type of luggage issued by Northwest Airlines. Phil saw that the man in the parking lot had a rumpled-up flight attendant uniform under his arm and placed it in the trunk of a car that he believed to be a Chevrolet Monte Carlo. Being a flight attendant, Phil thought that it was odd that another flight attendant would carry his uniform like that because it would be all wrinkled and disheveled the next day. This struck him as very odd behavior. As Phil recalled what he saw, he became convinced that the man who he had seen in the parking lot was not a flight attendant at all, but was actually Nancy's killer. Detectives quickly met with Phil and had a sketch artist draw a rendering of the man he saw while it was still fresh in his mind. When complete, the sketch matched the creepy man in the hotel stairwell mentioned by the two other witnesses. A few days after the murder, Northwest Airlines offered a $25,000 reward for information leading to the arrest and conviction of the person who killed Nancy. Nancy was said to have been beautiful with a great smile. She was adventurous and fun-loving. Nancy had always wanted to be a flight attendant, and when she finally landed her dream job, she loved it. Her co-workers at Northwest loved her too. At the same time that the reward was offered, Detroit Free Press reporter Tom Henderson started thinking about a new member of his running group who seemed strange. It seems that this man would arrive at the designated meeting spot that the running group had set and then would go change into his running clothes in the bathroom. The newcomer to the group claimed that he could run a 39-minute 10K, and for those of you not familiar with running, 39 minutes is a really good time for a 10K race, which is 6.2 miles long. It was immediately obvious to the group that the man was lying about his running prowess and that he wasn't anywhere near in shape to be part of our serious running group after their first run. Then the man's lies became more unsettling. He started dating one of the women in the club. A mutual acquaintance of both spoke to the woman privately to let her know that the man was definitely not a pilot for Northwest Airlines, which he had claimed. That was a big ruse. And right around this time, Nancy was murdered. Members of the group started putting two and two together. This guy was falsely using a Northwest pilot's uniform to meet women and trying to convince them that he's a well-respected pilot. At the same time, a Northwest flight attendant was murdered. Tom then notified the police to share his suspicions. He told the police that they should speak with the man, who was named Michael, regarding the murder. So police did look into Michael, and it turns out he had been arrested right around the time of Nancy's murder for acting all creepo near a local school. He went to a public school in suburban Detroit and said he was a pilot and would love to make a presentation to the students in the school auditorium. After having the police called on him, apparently for creeping out the school staff, police came and questioned him. Upon searching Michael's car, they discovered a complete Northwest Airlines pilot uniform in the trunk. This was enough to convince police that they may have found Nancy's killer. He was arrested at the school and taken to the Macomb County Jail just outside of Detroit. Detectives rushed to the jail to interrogate him about the murder. They also took a DNA sample and had it analyzed to compare it to the DNA taken from Nancy's crime scene. When the results came back, the detectives were stunned. The DNA results taken from Michael were not a match to Nancy's killer's DNA. He was cleared of Nancy's murder, but was found to be a creepy con man. So back to square one. As all of this was happening and time was passing by, Art Ludwig managed to maintain a heavy media presence and kept the pressure on to find Nancy's killer. It was now his life's work. Seeing Art on the news, a stranger made a call to Art's home phone. The caller on the phone said he had information about Nancy's murder that he wanted to share. The only catch was that the caller only wanted to talk to Art directly, not the police, and he wanted to meet in person to discuss what he knew. So Art agreed to come to Detroit, and remember he lived in Minnesota, and meet the man in person at a diner. But first, Art spoke with detectives in Detroit to let them know what was going on. Not knowing who the man was or if he was dangerous, he could have been the killer after all, two undercover police officers went to the diner and sat near Art as he talked with the stranger. The man was a little older than Art and seemed believable as Art spoke with him. That is, he seemed believable up until he handed some papers to Art with a bunch of stuff written in Russian on them. Turns out the man had some bizarre theory that Nancy was killed by Russian secret agents. Art was dismayed that he came all this way just to hear some ridiculous musings by a lonely man with too much time on his hands. Police looked into the man but wrote him off as a suspect. So back to square one again. As time passed on, Art became increasingly frustrated with the lack of progress on the case. So frustrated, in fact, that he went back to Detroit and started investigating the case himself. He also got local TV crews to document his investigation. He went back to room 354 at the hotel to look for answers, but came up empty. The investigation stalled on all fronts, and the case went cold. For the next 10 years, nothing of any consequence happened. In 2001, however, the Michigan State Police received federal funding to use DNA forensics, a tool that had not been available at the time of Nancy's murder, to look into cold cases. Police sent semen samples taken from the murder scene to a lab for analysis, and the results came back quickly. The lab director called Detective Greg Kilborn and told him that they got a hit on the sample. The DNA was linked to another unsolved murder that took place 5 years earlier in Flint, Michigan, which was about 80 miles or 129 kilometers from the hotel where Nancy was murdered. In November 1986, University of Michigan Flint music professor and provost Margaret Eby was murdered in her home. The crime scene in that murder was very similar to Nancy's. Professor Eby's neck had been slashed in a similarly brutal and violent manner. She was found in her bed and had also been the victim of a sexual assault. The killer washed himself down in the bathroom, just like he had in Nancy's hotel room. Blood and semen were collected from the crime scene, and a partial fingerprint had been found on the faucet. Every one of Professor Eby's students was looked at as a potential suspect, and investigators particularly looked at whether any of the students were angry or infatuated with the professor. No suspects were identified, however, and the samples taken at the crime scene, as well as the partial fingerprint, were filed away as evidence. In 2001, detectives entered the partial fingerprint taken back from 1986 from Margaret Eby's murder scene into a new national state fingerprint database as part of the federal grant. There was an immediate hit. The fingerprint was matched to a man named Jeffrey Gorton, and it turns out that Gorton's face bore a striking resemblance to the police sketch of the man that had been seen outside the hotel where Nancy was murdered. Finally, detectives believe they found Nancy's killer. In looking more deeply at Gorton's history, it was found that he had joined the U.S. Navy in the early 1980s and immediately began preying on women in Florida where he was stationed. Gorton was entering women's homes, stealing their undergarments, and amassing a large collection of them. In one incident, he came up from behind on two female Navy officers, knocked them both to the ground, and ripped a skirt off of one of them. This was done in broad daylight, so he was a brazen criminal even as a 19-year-old. Gorton was arrested for sexual assault of the two women, dishonorably discharged from the Navy, and served 6 months in prison. Gorton's criminal behavior continued after being released, though. In 1984, at the age of 21, he was convicted in an Orlando courtroom of 2 counts of robbery and 2 counts of burglary of a dwelling. In that case, he was sentenced to serve 4.5 years in prison, but was released the following year. His fingerprints were taken and entered into the National Criminal Database as a result of either one or both of these run-ins with the law. It's not entirely clear. In December 1985, Gorton was paroled and moved back to Michigan, where he was originally from, and got a job in his family's landscaping business where he installed and maintained sprinkler systems. While the partial fingerprint and likeness to the police sketch put Gorton on the radar as a suspect in both murders, prosecutors felt that it was not enough evidence to go to trial with. They needed a DNA match, but didn't have any confirmed DNA from Gorton on file, so an around-the-clock surveillance operation was put on Gorton in an effort to obtain his DNA. Remember, we're in 2001 now, 10 years after Nancy's murder and 15 years after Professor Eby's murder. And by this time, Gorton had somehow managed to get married and was a father of 2 children. During the round-the-clock surveillance, Gorton took his kids to a local skating rink. As they roller skated, Gorton sat at a table with a snack and soft drink. 2 plainclothes police officers inside the rink were able to grab a napkin and a cup that he had left on the table. And from those 2 items, they were able to get Gorton's DNA and have it analyzed. The next morning, state police analysts indicated that the preliminary results confirmed that Gorton's DNA was a match to the DNA taken from Nancy's hotel room, as well as Margaret Eby's home. From this point forward, it was clear to police that they had found Nancy's killer. The DNA evidence enabled detectives to obtain a search warrant for Gorton's home, so they showed up at his door, took him to the Michigan State Police for questioning, and at the same time searched Gorton's home, including his garage. In the garage was the exact model and color car that police had been looking for. It was the Chevrolet Monte Carlo that Phil Arcia saw a man loading that flight attendant's luggage and uniform into the hotel parking lot the night of Nancy's murder. In the attic of Gorton's house, police found a huge stash of women's clothing, most of it stored in large plastic bags. There were hundreds of pieces of undergarments, maybe even thousands, and some of them even had women's names written on them. There were so many pieces of clothing, in fact, that police stopped inventorying each specific item and instead organized them into bundles of similar garment types. Then police found something even more disturbing in the attic. It was a stash of videotapes. On these tapes, Gorton had secretly recorded people using his home bathroom. And there were also videos of Gorton recording himself, trying on and posing in many of the pieces of women's undergarments that he had collected. With all these items found, though, not one of them matched up to Nancy or Margaret Eby as far as police could tell. Nevertheless, Gorton was arrested in February 2002 for double murder, as well as criminal sexual conduct, armed robbery, and burglary. His arrest came almost 11 years to the day of Nancy's death. He was put on trial in September 2002 for Nancy's murder and was found guilty. He then pleaded no contest to the rape and murder of Margaret Eby. As a result of his guilty verdicts, Gorton received both a 40 to 80-year prison sentence and a life sentence with no possibility of parole. None of the evidence found in his home was linked to any other unsolved crimes, although it seems likely that these were not the only two attacks perpetrated by Gorton. Today, the hotel where Nancy was killed is still open, but is operated as a Delta Hotels by Marriott. It's located at 31500 Wick Road in Romulus, Michigan. With multiple renovations over the years since then, the rooms have been renumbered. There's no longer a room numbered 354, so it's unclear exactly which room the attack took place in. Jeffrey Wayne Gorton is inmate number 428571 in the Michigan Department of Corrections. He is housed at the Richard A. Handlin Correctional Facility in Ionia, Michigan, and is serving a total of 8 sentences, including the life sentence and the 40 to 80-year sentence. He will never be released from prison. So you may recall that in earlier episodes, I had some Netflix and podcast suggestions, and I wanted to bring up a program I've recently watched on Netflix that you might be interested in. The program is called Deep Water. It's an Australian crime drama that debuted in 2016 and is based on the historical unsolved murders of up to 80 gay men in suburban Sydney, Australia, back in the 1980s and 90s. There are some interesting subplots in the series, and the acting is very well done. Again, the show is called Deep Water, and it's very well produced. It's getting an 80% audience score on Rotten Tomatoes, so I recommend you check it out if you haven't already. You've been listening to Great Lakes True Crime. To follow us on social media, please search for Great Lakes True Crime on Facebook or Twitter. You can also email the show with case suggestions. Just send your mail to greatlakestruecrime@gmail.com. And if you like the show, please leave us a 5-star review on your podcast app. It's a huge help to us. It helps get the word out about our show. And that's all we have for this episode. Thanks for listening, guys.